Hi, I'm Rahel Philipose, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express News Show. In this episode, we talk about a Supreme Court verdict that's set to change how election commissioners will be appointed. We also talk about the origins of COVID-19 and the Wuhan lab leak theory. But first, we talk about the election results of Tripura, Meghalaya and Nagaland, which were declared yesterday. And in 2 out of these 3 states, the BJP has managed to come back. In Nagaland, the BJP is likely to come back to power with its coalition partner, the Nationalist Democratic Progressive Party, and in Tripura, they gained a simple majority and celebrations in Agartala started even before the results were declared officially. But in Meghalaya, however, the BJP did not win a majority, and at the time of this recording, it is uncertain whether it will join hands with its former coalition partner, the National People's Party, which is currently in the lead right now. To discuss what these results mean for the party, my colleague Utsa Sarmin spoke to the Indian Express's Liz Mathew, who covers the BJP for the paper.
So Liz, can you tell us what this win in Tripura and Nagaland mean for the BJP?
See, certainly it is like BJP is continuing its kind of dominance in terms of influence in the northeastern politics. Of course, all the state except Assam has more prominence for the regional parties. But BJP as a national party is the party which has developed and or emerged as winners in most of the states. So this is in line with what BJP has been saying, that there are policy of look east and bringing northeast also into the development map, just like any other state. That the party leaders say it has succeeded, and the message has really gone down well to the electorate also. The people have taken that seriously. So it is a kind of another recognition for the BJP's development politics. And also the main accusation against BJP in this state was especially in Meghalaya and Nagaland, were that they are anti-Christians. So this message, the BJP is saying that this is kind of taken over, and that also has been countered and kind of defeated by the party in this election.
Right, and in Meghalaya, the BJP didn't gain the majority and its previous coalition partner NPP is leading at the time of this recording. So are there any conversations about forming a post-poll alliance with NPP or other regional parties in the state?
Yes, certainly BJP leaders like especially Himanta Biswa Sharma, the Assam Chief Minister, who is the kind of point man for the BJP in the Northeast. He's the Chief Strategist also. He has already started conversation with the Chief Minister and Konrad Sagma. We have seen some reports of so-called quote-unquote secret meetings between the leaders in Guwahati on Tuesday. So, of course, BJP's tally hasn't, as of now, doesn't look like improved. But the party would like to wield its influence. And also, when it comes to the regional parties in the Northeast, they always like to have or be in the same line with the center party. The party in power at the center for the development and the projects, because they solely depend on not their revenue in tax revenue or something. They solely depend on the center support for their financial any initiatives. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi's initiatives in terms of, welfare politics, welfare measures, the schemes were quite popular in all these states. And also the programs for the youth, some ministers were, union ministers were there to communicate about this. And they were trying to convey and communicate this message of Prime Minister Modi's welfare initiatives as well as the development agenda to the people. So obviously they would not like to leave it. Last time also they had, 3 only in Meghalaya, but the BJP had tremendous influence on the government because of the assistance the center is providing to the states.
Right, and what about the chief ministers of Tripura and Nagaland? Has that been decided by the party yet?
Yeah, in Nagaland, of course, this is NDPP, so it is the big brother in the alliance. So the BJP will have to leave it. So I think most probably the current incumbent chief minister is expected to continue. When it comes to Tripura, there the question is slightly different because BJP leaders had, informally had given enough indication that if party wins clear majority, they would like to have Pratima Bhaumik, who would be the first woman chief minister of northeastern state if she becomes the chief minister. I think with BJP and Prime Minister Modi, is keen on pushing this message or, for the women-centric politics of the BJP for the 2024 election. There is a chance that it could be Manik Saha could be brought to the center, like Pratima Bhaumik is the MOS in the union government now. So she could go as the state chief minister. So that would give BJP a lot of message. She's come up from the, the grassroots. So the way that women empowerment message also will be there, and also, the first time, as we know in Tripura, the most of the women exceeded the number of women voters, exceeded the number of men voters. So it would be a very good message for BJP, the entire region and entire country. So there is a possibility of changing the CM.
And Liz, considering that 5 major states are going into polls this year and the Lok Sabha polls are just a year away, how do you think BJP's success in Tripura and Nagaland will impact the upcoming elections?
Of course, it will have an impact. Primarily, if you say that any election victory for a moral boost for the cadre and the party to go forward to the next election campaign. Especially now, we know that BJP has been under criticism for this Hindenburg report and also for the action it has taken on BBC. And a lot of criticism was there were the party and the government were under fire from the opposition. A lot of setbacks have come from the judiciary also. In such a moment, such a victory would give them a lot of energy to go into immediately to Karnataka election, which is coming up soon. And then towards the end of the year, we will have Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh and, the very key states. So then the BJP is one. The development message and the narrative which they want to create around this Labhartis, which is beneficiaries of the government scheme, that will be reaffirmed. And the women message, if the party is moving into installing a woman CM in Tripura, then again the woman, that message also. And we have seen, internal feud in some of these, even in Nagaland also there were issues. Tripura, of course, there were issues because they changed the CM a few months back. So there were internal feud. But that message of the development, the welfare politics and the Prime Minister's image, whatever, it has overtaken the small issues of you being anti-minority, you anti-tribal. That was their main accusation against BJP in Tripura. The party could overshadow these kind of argument and project their whatever the positive agenda of governance and development and welfare politics.
Next, we talk about the origins of COVID-19. For the past few years, several global agencies, including many in the US, have been investigating the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to find where exactly the SARS-CoV-2 virus emerged from. And recently, the United States Department of Energy, which was previously undecided on the matter, said that they believe the virus most likely leaked from a laboratory in Wuhan and did not emerge organically. And then after this on Tuesday, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation said his agency was also of the opinion that the origins of the pandemic were most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan. In this segment, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha about the theory and why it has been contentious.
Amitabh, before we talk about this Wuhan lab leak theory, could you tell us why is it important for us to find out how this virus originated?
Right. So you need to know where the virus came from because that will give you an understanding of how viruses like these spread and what are the threats to human beings in future. So if you need to prevent these kind of pandemics in the future, you need to know exactly how this one originated, where it came from, how did it move to the human beings, which animal host did it jump from, if it indeed jumped from an animal host, which place did it jump from, and what was the entire mechanism for. So it gives us a very useful data point in our efforts to prevent similar outbreaks in future.
Okay, so now let's talk about this lab leak theory. I mean, Initially, it was dismissed by a lot of people, including many scientists. And now with these two US agencies saying that they also believe in it, do you think it will find more acceptance?
I mean, depends on which side of the fence you are on. This has been a very, very contentious issue right from the very start. In fact, the lab leak theory was the first one. The very natural conclusion amongst people at the start of the pandemic was that it probably leaked out of the laboratory in Wuhan, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is a very well-known center for the study of coronavirus. Scientists carry out different kinds of research on coronavirus and other viruses as well, but it's a very well-known center for coronavirus research. Now, the first cases were reported very close to this institution, and the very natural and very obvious conclusion in the initial part of the pandemic was that it might have leaked out of the lab. It might have spilled over.
Yeah, I mean, the idea was that here's a lab that researches this virus, the virus originated nearby, so it was possible.
It was very possible, and that's why I say it was a very obvious kind of a conclusion initially for people to link the origin of the virus to this particular laboratory. Now, what happened was quite early during the pandemic, there was a very vehement opposition to this idea that the virus had originated from the laboratory. There were scientists who came out and ridiculed this kind of proposition and said it was a conspiracy to show China in bad light, and that there was overwhelming evidence apparently to show that it had emerged naturally, meaning that it jumped from animals to human beings in a natural sort of progression, the way many previous pandemics or small epidemics have been caused. The SARS-1 in 2002 had emerged naturally, organically, jumping from an animal to humans. The MERS virus in around 2008, again, had a similar kind of origin. The virus jumped from animals to human beings. Now, with this particular SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, we are 3.5 years into the pandemic, and that conclusive proof, it's completely elusive despite lots of attempts to find that linkage. So this issue continues to remain unsettled.
And Amitabh, I suppose it was a bit suspect that without having done any research, scientists were immediately dismissing the lab leak theory.
Exactly. So, it should have raised red flags at that point of time itself. I mean, there wasn't enough evidence to completely rule out the lab leak theory at that point of time. But that's another thing that we have to look at. I mean, the conduct of certain scientists and certain scientific institutions have not been up to the mark. So when with very few evidence, practically, very little evidence at that point of time in March and April of 2020, scientists were out to say that even investigating the possibility that the virus might have emerged in the lab was considered blasphemous, at that point of time. And actually, the vehemence with which this theory was attacked, the vehemence with which it was opposed, ironically, that is what strengthened this argument further. Now, of course, later on, there is a lot of evidence that gathered thanks to lots of, anonymous researchers, lots of people who are on the internet, freelance researchers, who dug out huge amount of information which actually pointed to the fact that it might have come from the leak. And if you just look at the kind of people who are opposing the lab leak theory, there was a very clear conflict of interest of those people. And this person, a scientist called Peter Daszak, his name comes up again and again. He was the first one who organized a letter in one of the scientific journals. He himself signed it, and he got 15, 17 other scientists to sign it. That was the first statement that came out from scientists, which said that this entire lab leak theory is a conspiracy and that there was an overwhelming evidence that this virus had emerged naturally. Now, it was only later that it emerged that Peter Daszak had a straight conflict of interest, that he ran an organization called EcoHealth Alliance in New York, which was funding the Wuhan Institute of Virology and funding that institution specifically for coronavirus research.
So the person who approved and organized this statement actually had a fair bit to lose if the Wuhan Institute of Virology got a bad reputation.
Exactly. He could have been in the dock. His research grants could have been questioned. The conduct of that institution could have been questioned. So he was very, very directly involved. And of course, the lay people like you and me, even media organizations probably would not be aware of these kind of connections. But the scientific community definitely was. The virologist community across the world definitely knew what was going on, definitely knew DASAC's association with Wuhan Institute of Technology. And I'm sure the journals that were publishing those letters and statements, they probably were aware. And nobody pointed this out. Nobody raised the red flag. Nobody said that there was a sure shot conflict of interest here. In scientific journals, whatever you publish, you have to declare whether the authors of that article have any conflict of interest, any financial conflict of interest, any other conflict of interest. That has to be stated very upfront with every article that gets published in these journals. Now, here was a very, very straight conflict of interest, and nobody thought it was important to point this out. Nobody thought it was important to state this upfront. And it doesn't stop at that. I mean, this DASAC then goes on to give interviews after interviews wherein he completely rules out any possibility of this coming from lab leak. And then he goes on to be appointed as a member on the World Health Organization team that is supposed to go to Wuhan and investigate the origins of the virus. So he gets on the WHO team as well. And of course, that committee also concluded that the wealth of evidence was actually in favor of natural emergence and not lab leak.
And so do you think what certain scientists did in this case affected the credibility of the larger scientific community?
It has. And we are already seeing it. And the problem is even the larger scientific community has not reprimanded, has not taken a stand on this issue, which seems like a very clear conflict of interest, very unscientific conduct, in a way, a very deceitful conduct by certain individuals and certain organizations. And the larger scientific community has not condemned it, has not called this out, because of which, in the long term, it's very likely that the credibility of the institution itself will be questioned. And that's a sad thing because, already you see lots of people making very, very unscientific statements and saying if the experts can go so wrong, they will be wrong on every other thing as well. I mean, we have seen in different ways in this pandemic that scientists probably should have exercised more caution, as they generally do. In normal circumstances, they generally do exercise a lot of caution. They're very careful about what they say. They're very careful to spell out the boundary conditions. In what ranges are their statements true? But during this crisis, we have seen people going off the mark on several occasions.
And so then do you think this kind of behavior, this kind of attitude has come in the way of us truly finding out the origins of this virus?
I think it's a lost case now. I don't think we will ever be able to settle this question of whether this virus originated naturally or it came from the lab. There are evidence, both the possibilities are still open, but I don't think the manner in which it has got so contentious, I don't think it's ever going to get settled. This new round of opinion from some US agencies, I don't think it's going to change the course of this debate in any significant way.
And next, we talk about the Election Commission, the autonomous body in charge of conducting free and fair elections in the country. Yesterday, the Supreme Court delivered a verdict that will change how the top election officials are appointed in the country. Traditionally, the government had a free hand in appointing these officials. But after this judgment, they will be appointed by a 3-member committee comprising the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and the Chief Justice of India. To know more about this verdict and its implications, we speak to the Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath. So Apurva, can you begin by telling us about the role and the importance of the Election Commission?
So the Election Commission is a constitutional body. Article 324 of the Constitution prescribes the mandate of an election commission, talks about, the appointment of election commissioners, the chief election commissioner, and what essentially is their job. So the election commission basically administers elections to the Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, state legislative assemblies, the state legislative councils, and also to the offices of the president and vice president of the country. So this is the mandate in Article 324 of the Constitution. And there is also the Representation of People's Act, which then governs the process of these elections. There are specifically how the Election Commission goes about conducting elections in a democracy as large as India.
Right. Now we're talking about this body because the Supreme Court judgment is set to change the way the Chief Election Commissioner and the election commissioners are going to be appointed. But before we talk about that, could you talk about how people have traditionally been appointed to these positions?
So Article 324 pretty much only says that they will be appointed by the president, and the Constituent Assembly adds a line saying that there will be a procedure prescribed by law, because they actually debate this scenario where the president can appoint somebody at his own will. And there is a discussion in the Constituent Assembly, and then they come to a conclusion that it should not just be that, and there should be a legislative process behind this appointment. But since independence, we've not had that legislative process. There has been a convention according to which the appointment is made, and there is a specific legislation which governs the service terms and conditions. So the Election Commission Conditions of Service of Election Commissioners and Transaction of Business Act 1991, this act basically says that an election commissioner shall hold an office for a term of 6 years or up to the age of 65, whichever is earlier, and things like that. That act also talks about removal of an election commissioner. And there is a pretty high bar when it comes to removal, that the Chief Election Commissioner of India can be removed from their office in a manner similar to the removal of a judge of the Supreme Court of India, which means it is a 2/3 majority that is required in both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, and on the only ground that is on proven misbehavior or incapacity. So it's a pretty high bar that even through the legislation that, is set for the CEC. But how they get appointed is only mandated by a convention, which is the Law Ministry draws up a list of potential candidates, and the election commissioners have always been drawn from the IAS cadre. So a list of these suitable officers is sent to the Prime Minister's office, and, somebody is picked and appointed by the Prime Minister. But does that satisfy the test of having a legislative process was essentially what was being challenged in the Supreme Court right now.
Right. And could you tell us more about this challenge?
So this is a PIL that was first filed in 2015. And there was subsequently another PIL which was filed sometime in 2018 by Delhi BJP leader Ashwini Upadhyay. So the Supreme Court then decided to club these matters and refer them to a larger constitution bench. So a 5-judge bench was supposed to hear these cases. But when Chief Election Commissioner Arun Goel was being appointed last year, Prashant Bhushan moved the Supreme Court and sought the court's intervention on this. And that was sort of a trigger for the court to hear the case expeditiously. So the court reserved its judgment sometime in November last year, and the verdict has now been pronounced.
All right. And can you talk to us about the arguments that were made by the bench while pronouncing this verdict?
So yesterday, a 5-judge constitution bench of the Supreme Court, headed by Justice K.M. Joseph, ruled that a high-power committee, which would consist of the Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition of the Lok Sabha, and the Chief Justice of India, would pick the CEC and the 2 other election commissioners. So this is a very significant verdict because it changes how the government has appointed election commissioners since independence. And this is a model that the court follows, like how we have appointments in the case of the director of CBI or the Enforcement Directorate. This similar pattern to be followed when it comes to appointment of CEC and the election commissioners. So the court's rationale is that there is a vacuum in law. The constitution says that there must be a legislative process, and there isn't one. So in that case, the court can step in and make law. So this is the court's way forward for now. But it also comes with a caveat that this would prevail till the parliament comes up with a legislative process of its own. So now it is up to the government to either come up with its own law to govern this process, which could again, change from the CJI, the Leader of Opposition and the Prime Minister. It could change from that panel to solely the Prime Minister's office picking the election commissioners again. But that's the remit of the government. Till that happens, till that legislative process is brought in, the verdict of the court that this high-powered committee will pick the election commissioners, that will stay.
And Apurva, what will be the implications of this change, especially considering the fact that the leader of the opposition will now be part of the decision-making process?
So the Supreme Court here is essentially talking about elections being a fair and neutral process in a democracy. So here the court says that the will of the majority, when it prevails, should also take into consideration protection of rights of minority. And, the court actually says don't think of these terms only in the regional and linguistic references, but in the broader context of what this means in a democracy. But this is still method suggested in the interim till there is a legislative process. And the big question that the government argued against also was about whether this would amount to judicial activism and the court really stepping into the role of the executive and making policy. But the court here justifies its interference or intervention, saying that it's not as if the first accusation against the independence of the EC was concerned and the court stepped in to do something. The court is saying that we've been watching this since 1950, but only because there is a vacuum, we're stepping in now. And it justifies its intervention by citing past examples, which include, for example, the Vishaka guidelines that the court had given about curbing sexual harassment in workplace. So in the absence of a law, the court can step in and make law, is what the court is emphasizing in its ruling. And we see this in the case of the selection process when it comes to Director CBI, Director ED, right? That there is a 3-member panel, and there have been several instances where the leader of opposition dissents and the casting vote is decided by the Chief Justice, along with the Prime Minister. That is a very common process. In fact, when it came to the appointment of CBI Director Alok Verma, Mallikarjun Kharge, who was the leader of opposition, in fact dissented, and Alok Verma went on to be appointed. Interestingly, even when Alok Verma was sought to be removed from his office, Mallikarjun Kharge dissented, but it still happened. So having the leader of opposition in this high-powered panel is just check and balance, but that doesn't in itself translate to a veto to the opposition or bigger say than the government itself in the panel.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was hosted by me, Rahel Philipose and Utsa Sarmin, and written and produced by Utsa Sarmin with the help of me, Rahel Philipose, and Shashank Bhargava. It was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone who you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.